or what different archetypes you fall into, or how you want to steer your game towards, like what type of fun are you going for? I mean, there's other ones out there, like some people play because they really like the art. So basically by understanding where you fall into, or if you want to try to cover the whole scheme of things like that, that can be helpful for your game. So, I mean, me personally, I probably have all over the map because, well, I do like party games. I do like being a socializer and playing party games. But at the same time, I mean, well, I feel like I win a lot of games, so I want people to still play with me. So I want to play games that are hard for me so that I can still play with other people. So I'm probably like all of them to some degree, but Chivos, well, yeah. What kind of games do you play?
Yeah, so I would say that personally, I probably, at different times, I'm all of them for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably not a killer. I think I'm probably not a killer, so you heard it here first. I'm not a crook.
That's exactly what a killer is. No.
Exactly. But yeah, I would say that for me personally, I'm probably a bit more of an achiever than I am a socializer. I like people, I like hanging out with them, but I don't necessarily need to be playing a game with them, like just getting a drink or hanging out or having a nice conversation or a walk or whatever is good enough for me. So like I don't necessarily need a game to be the way that I connect with people and have a conversation. I do enjoy exploring games and game content. I really like the digital indie games. That's kind of like my jam. I once a year I just raid it over winter over Steam and play for a weekend. And I would say that to a certain point, achievement is important to me. But so like I guess a good way to describe it is that like people are more of some categories and less of others, and perhaps not just always like you're not always a killer or you're not always a socializer.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just want to hang out and play a game. So there's also other demographics. This is kind of what Bartlett found in the Memoir space. There are things like how old you are, or like what do you do professionally, or like how far along are you in your education. Like a child would have different preferences for games, have different things that would be fun than an adult. Like if you had like a spelling game, might bore your mom to death, but like your son or grandson might just be completely enthralled with the C-A-T. I spelled cat. Oh my god, this is the most fun game I've ever played. So the idea here is that we are going to be designing games for different groups of people, and that it helps when you're designing your game to kind of think about who is this game for, who will enjoy it. And you don't necessarily have to have that planned out in the beginning. As you work on your game, you might find like, oh my god, kids love this game. Let me focus on them, make it the most fun possible for them. Or it might be the complete opposite, where you're just like the hardcore war gamer, heavy metal death shirt, long beard in the back of a game room. Maybe your game's for them, and maybe they'll just love it and adore it. So anyway, the point here is that we are trying to include balancing in our game design in order to appeal to these different kinds of players. And these are more general concepts, and now we're going to get a little bit more into detail about concepts of balancing. So, what is balancing? Balancing overall is the idea that different choices you make in the game, different pieces of content, are all possible choices for the player, okay? Your goal is to make it so that when a player enters the game that they have a bunch of decisions to make, they have a bunch of choices to make, and that none of those choices are either really, really bad or really, really good, okay? So the problem here is that if a game is highly imbalanced, you might have a very bad choice that players never make. And if they have a game that's like also in the same vein, if it's too imbalanced, you might have a choice that's really, really good that players always make. So those two sides are kind of to be avoided, because if the decision is too simple, like it's obviously this or obviously not that, you're taking interesting decisions away from your players. And I would argue that also you don't want your game to be too balanced. Well, some people want that, but I think that too balanced is kind of like a silent danger in game design, where if you make it so that all decisions are so equally balanced that any decision is a good decision, then again, you're taking the decisions away from your players. So like, I have a funny, well, I guess everybody might have this story where like they played a game of Cards Against Humanity or Apples to Apples, but you didn't choose your card, you just picked one at random, and then accidentally won. So I did that once just to see if it would happen, and it did. And the point here is that that game is kind of more of an activity. It's meant to be a fun thing for people to do together for socializing reasons, but not necessarily for achievement or competitive reasons. And in that way, the fact that those cards are kind of like all equally valid as options, they can all get you towards a victory because you can choose random ones and win. But that promotes that kind of gameplay, that kind of experience overall. So my point that I'm trying to get at here is that in that game, it's fine because that's what they're going for. But in other games, you might want more strategy. You might want player skill to play a bigger role in the game performance. And in those cases, if the game is fully balanced, where all options are equally viable, you're not necessarily going to help your players out. Like the players might not enjoy it if they're just like, man, I just did things for 10 turns and then we tied. Or like, I just did things for 7 turns and then I won by a point or lost by a point or something like that. Might not feel good to your players. So one thing I do want to talk about is that let's say that there are no fully balanced or fully imbalanced games. Basically not. Because games have some squishiness, they have rules, they have content. But the idea is that they're going to be on the spectrum. Okay, so where the content is either more balanced or less balanced. I think I got my hand motions there wrong. But anyway, so the point here is that imbalanced games, I would say, are good for short games, and they're good for less strategic or chaotic games. They're good for party games, and yeah, and just in general, you want to keep it, if you want your game to have like interesting or exciting moments where things like change rapidly, having more imbalance in your game could be a very good choice. Whereas the opposite is true. You want more balance in games that are things like very long games, strategic games, games that are serious or competitive. You want to make sure that they are more balanced. They don't have to be perfectly balanced, but more balanced. And part of that is that in an imbalanced game, players, since the play is short, if something weird happens, if a player draws a card that just wins them the game, that's fun, that's exciting, the game ends and you can play again. But if the game is long and that happens in hour 3 of your 6-hour whatever game, that's a worse player experience overall. You can't just kind of end the game and then try again. So anyway, the point here is that there is a place for more imbalanced games and there is a place for more balanced games. And it's kind of trying to pick out where those games should be. So, so for new designers, a very common topic is how do you balance games? And there are different ways of doing it, but today I'm going to talk a little bit on the math side. So you notice this very intimidating pad over here that I have a bunch of numbers written on. We're going to talk about this in 1 second, but the idea is that one way to do it is with math. So, sorry, the secret ingredient is math, and the way that you use it is that very often when you have a game, if you can quantify the values in the game, okay, if you can like assign a number to them, like this card gives me 3 apples and this card gives me 2 pears, you can then convert those numbers into a single value and compare them, and now you have a good idea of how strong the different things in your game are. Okay, largely I'm going to recommend that you get comfortable with using spreadsheets, even for simple games. Okay, so even if your game is just like apples and oranges and you play 5 cards and somebody wins, you can still use spreadsheets, a little bit of math, and balance your game out, and in that way you're saving yourself a lot of playtesting time. Ultimately, you still need to playtest. That's still very important because you need to see how players feel about it. You need to see whether the game sticks with them, whether they enjoy it or not. Playtesting is the bottom line. That's the truth, okay? But on your way there, do you want to have to playtest your game 50 times to figure out what's balanced, or do you want to playtest your game, or do you want to spend some time with a spreadsheet and then playtest your game 5 times and figure out that it's balanced? And if you take away anything from this talk, it's to spend a little bit of time with a napkin, so do a little bit of math, spend a little bit of time with a spreadsheet if you want to do that, then play test your game and it'll speed you up a lot. I'm just trying to save you all a lot of time. That's the point of this talk. So, anyway, one common idea when balancing a game is to convert everything into one resource. So let's say you have a game that has like you have actions that you take every turn, and you have money, and you have victory points. And you have different cards in the game that's like, oh, spend 3 actions to get 2 money. And another card that says turn 4 money into 1 victory point, okay? So you have these different pieces of card content, but if you can convert them all into one resource, then it becomes very easy to compare these cards to each other. So, for example, with the math we just did, 3 actions is 2 money. 4 money is 1 victory point. So we can say that, let's see, so it'd be 3 for 2, it'd be 6 actions is roughly worth 1 victory point with that math there, basically. So that's the idea, is that now that you kind of know that 6 actions is 6 actions is 4 money, and 4 money is 1 victory point, now you can start converting the values of cards into this one thing. It doesn't matter which one it is, but the point is that you now have these numbers that you can compare to each other. So we're going to take a little look at everyone's favorite game, Uno. So the idea here is that the Uno deck consists of a bunch of cards 0 to 9. Okay, that's most of the deck. We have reverse cards, we have skip, draw 2, wild, and wild draw 4. And the idea here is that if these didn't exist down here, the game would be completely balanced. All these cards have equal ability to improve your place in the game. You play a number, you play a color. If you can't, you draw a card. And if we were to play this game, it might take hours for somebody to win. It might take forever. And it'd be kind of boring because you know exactly what your decision is, right? But once you start introducing the other cards, now you're starting to get this imbalanced territory. These cards are largely stronger than those cards overall, which means that these cards, which constitute most of the deck, are a little bit weaker than average, okay? So these are some details that you're now realizing about this game that you haven't played since you were 6 or 10 or something. But the idea here is that if we can convert these all into how many cards you now have at the end of, or the players have at the end of a cycle. So like if me and Josh here are playing a game of Uno, one-on-one, and I play a card and you play a card, with these cards we're perfectly fair. I've played 1 card, he's played 1 card, we're both down 1 card, right? So there's 0 gain for me as a player. No way for me to gain an advantage there. But if we introduce cards like skip or draw 2, if I play skip, Josh didn't get to play a card. I am now up 1 card on Josh. So I could say that this card is worth +1. If I have the draw 2, Josh will skip his turn and draw 2 cards. I now have 1 less card, and Josh now has 2 more cards. So that's a difference of 3, okay? So you can kind of see that as you convert them over to card differences, that like the wild draw 4 is way stronger than the other things in the game, okay? And that the draw 2 is also quite strong, and the skip is also pretty good. So the point here is that you can see that some of the cards in this game are purposely imbalanced, okay? And I think that these are largely good choices. The game design has been pretty steady for most of our lives. Uno is a very popular game. I wish I had designed Uno. But the point here is that they want imbalance in this game because the core of the game is too heavily balanced and it would take forever to play and be a little bit boring. But by having these other cards in the game, it means that a player who is trailing can pull ahead if a stronger player manages to play their cards right. Now they have a nice lead, and the game will kind of conclude itself because I've just buried you in cards and I cleaned up with like 2 or 3 cards. The other benefit here is that I think Uno is largely targeted to families and family games. So you have children, you have adults, you might have grandparents. Now, for the most part, adults and grandparents are going to have a large advantage against children, right? Just by and large, not trying to generalize too much, but children are still learning how things work, still learning how the game plays. Parents may have played Uno for 20, 30, 40 years. So the point I'm trying to get at is that by having these imbalanced cards in the game, it means that children who are largely going to perform worse than parents can still get some victories just by drawing better. And that's actually a feature of this game. By having it so that a player can just simply draw better occasionally and win is good in this particular situation. And the same thing applies to other games like Magic the Gathering or any competitive card games that like you draw some hands and just like, oh, I didn't draw any lands, I lose this game. That actually can be good for the environment, can be good for your players because it means that you don't always lose to the better player. With some players do like games like chess though, where like the better player will almost always win. But by having a little bit of randomness, by having a little bit of imbalanced content, it means that you can provide the weaker player a slightly better chance of winning, makes the game more interesting for them, more enjoyable for them. And like if I play against Magnus Carlsen, it'll take me 30 years to win 1 game, right? But if I play him in Uno, I might win in the 2nd or 3rd game. And that's enough to get me back to the table to back enjoying the game. So that's the idea here, is that like even with this very simple game, by converting the values here, you can see that you have some imbalanced cards, you can see what the values are as far as how imbalanced they are, and you have an idea of like what you want to do, how you want the game to feel. I think I can go into another topic. Although, if anybody has any questions, please let me know. So, although we will open it up at the end. All right. So this is one of your favorite games?
I do have a question. It has
Please.
to relate to your previous thing you were talking. No, before Uno actually.
Okay.
Actions. I forget what the second one was.
Sure.
Victory points.
Yeah, actions, apples, and victory points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about games like that, like Dominion comes to mind,
Sure.
is that the relative value of those changes
Right.
as the game progresses. So
Mhm.
the relative value of a victory point at the beginning is lower compared to actions
Right.
when you want to start like your engine, as opposed to the end.
Mhm.
So is that something maybe that you'll address it up?
The thing is that game design gets complicated very quickly, and like trying to understand it, like just going in and understanding the whole thing and how it works can be very difficult. What you're talking about specifically, I think, relates to what would have to be another talk. There is something called, let's see, Joris Dormans made an application that you have online called Machinations. I believe it used to be free and now it's paid. I don't necessarily recommend you go and learn how to use it, but understanding how it works is good. The idea there is that, I'm not going to draw it, but the idea is that they have these kinds of diagrams that you draw, and like basically it's tracking how resources move through your game. So like you might have a little like producer here, and you might have a pool here. So like as you make apples, they go in the pool, and when you want to make victory points, they go out of the pool, and you gain a victory point. And basically you draw a little diagram, and you can kind of see by the arrows as I move from place to place, like, oh, I have this cycle of apples to money, and apples turn to money, and money turns into apples, and eventually I turn apples into victory points, and then it ends that line. Now the thing is that if victory points are able to turn back into something else, now it gets even more complicated. So the idea here is that there are tools out there are people who have thought about concepts like that. That how do you track, how do you understand these complex systems? And in that example, we have like 3 or 4 different groups. But people do make those diagrams for things like digital games. Like someone drew it for basketball. And basketball actually has like 20 different pools, and like one is skill, and one is points, and one is this, and one is that. But yeah, it gets complicated quickly, and that is a related topic. But
Not quite what we're covering today.
not quite what we're covering today, but it's all game design. At the end of the day, it is all game design. I wish I had a better thought there. Anyway, yeah.
Do you want to touch on like the difference between kind of macro balance versus micro balance?
Oh, that's I hadn't thought about that, but I guess you're saying like from like balancing in a small situation versus a larger.
If a game is balanced on the whole,
Mhm.
right, that doesn't mean that every single decision point is balanced.
Oh,
All
sure.
the different systems are balanced.
Right.
So in the case of like Dominion,
Mhm.
right, you can kind of break down the decision points between the different phases of the game,
Mhm.
and that helps, I think, kind of encapsulate like how do you think of balance in the different phases
Oh,
of the game.
yeah, gotcha. So you're saying that like on any given turn, you might play an imbalanced card or make it a stronger or weaker decision, basically. But in the grand scheme of the game, they end up working out that ultimately it is balanced. Even if I had a really good first turn, I might have a worse later turn, and that balances it out.
And you might get into this with Hearthstone a little bit.
Maybe. So I was hoping to have a monitor and a spreadsheet, but here you go. Here's a spreadsheet. So the point here is that we're looking at a game called Hearthstone, which is one of your favorites,
Yes.
right? But we're looking at some of the very basic cards, and we're looking at things that we can quantify about those basic cards. For one, when you play a card, it always costs 1 card. You lose 1 card by playing it. And just to be, I'm not sure who here knows what Hearthstone is. I'm just going to say it for 2 seconds. Hearthstone is a digital card game. You play online. It's 1-on-1. I have 30 points of life. You have 30 points of life. We play some cards. Some of them are creatures. They attack. And I'm trying to get you down to 0. So not unlike a lot of other dueling card games. But the point here is that they is widely popular. It's a pretty easy example that I can use here. So anyway, if we look at some of these cards, I just picked 7 or 8 very simple cards in the game that you just start the game and boom, you have all these cards right away. So none of the good cards. We're looking at the bad cards. If you look at this card, I think it's called Murloc Tinyfin, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't put the names down. It costs 0. It has 1 attack and 1 defense. And we're just going to pretend that this kind of doesn't exist. We're just going to say that it has a total power of 2. Okay, we're just going to add those numbers together and be like, these are about the same. 2 power, great. So if we look at its card to power ratio, it's 2-to-1. If you look at its mana to power ratio, it's infinite. This card is obviously the best card in the game, right? Because it costs 0 mana and gives you 2 power. But overall, if you combine these costs, and you combine this power, right, you end up with a cost to power ratio of 2 to 1. Okay, so you can kind of see here that this card is giving you 2 benefits for 1 cost. And as you go down the list, everything costs 1 card, but we're using things of different amounts of mana. So for example, this one costs 1 mana, it has a total power of 3, it has 3 to 1 mana to power, 3 to 1 card to power, but only 1.5 to 1 cost to power. Okay? So you can kind of see that as we go down this list with the different numbers, I'm not going to talk them all through, but the point here is that you can see that as the mana cost increases, some of these cards are stronger in overall power, and some of them are weaker in overall power. For example, the Merla Tiny Fin is a little bit stronger than, for example, the, what is this card? Magma Rager?
The 3/5?
The 5/1 is the Magma Rager, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Magma Rager is kind of weak compared to the other cards. And basically here you can see that you can see these different numbers, see the different values, and kind of evaluate, like, am I happy with this content? Does this card need to be stronger? Does it need to be weaker? And make those decisions just by using this one value. So anyway, you can kind of see here that 2 is pretty strong, oddly enough. 1.5 to 1 seems to be pretty common. And some of them come up to even 1.885 to 1, or 1.8 or 1.66 to 1. So you can kind of tell which cards are a little bit more powerful, which cards are a little bit weaker, and in that way make those decisions about, like, oh, does this number need to change, does this card effect need to change, and so forth. I know this is a bunch of math. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about this kind of analysis? Please.
I haven't played Hearthstone, so
Sure.
this might not be how it works, but wouldn't it depend on, like, wouldn't you want to include a column for, like, how long it might stay on the field? Like, I
Sure.
assume something with higher defense is going to stay on the field
Right.
for several turns, and therefore its overall power would be significantly more than...
Yes, no, I absolutely agree, and that based on the rules of your game, these evaluations will change. Right now, so like this diagram is just like, boom, people are learning about balancing. Here's an example.
Okay.
It does get more nuanced though, because in Hearthstone, power is better than defense. Attack is better than defense, because attack can win the game, and defense can only make a creature not die, right? So like if I played a creature with 30 power, you play a creature with 30 defense, I will win the game on the next turn, and that's it, because I'm just going to hit you for 30 and that's that. So
I think the point is you can create whatever function combining attack and defense.
right,
But what he's doing here is he's taking a simple function rather than maybe 3 times attack or
Right,
4
right,
times
right.
defense.
What I'm trying to say is that in
Just
your
adding together to
Exactly.
make one number for power that he can then compare.
right, exactly. But yeah, in your game, the nuance of the math that you want to do to try to evaluate power levels is going to be unique to your game ultimately. In certain economic games, it tends to be a little bit easier because like apples are oranges and oranges are victory points, right? But in other games where these things have different properties, like attack deals damage, defense prevents things from dying, and so forth and so on, it can get complicated. It can be very nuanced. So you might need to make some adjustments. You might need to play the game a bit to get a feel for what those values should be. Anyway, we're gonna take a look at one more game, and then I think we're gonna just open up for questions after that. So, one more game, Android Netrunner. Pretty popular LCG. The idea of Android Netrunner is that it's a dueling card game. One player is the runner. They're trying to steal victory points from the corporation. The other player is the corporation. They're trying to like protect their victory points and like pass these agendas that are going to further their nefarious deeds. So the idea here is that we have a dueling card game, and the only important thing you need to know about Netrunner is that players have 4 actions on their turn, and an action can be used to draw a card, play a card, and get a money. And that's the entire game that I need you to know about right now to talk about this. So one action is a money, one action is a card, and one action is playing a card. Okay. So the idea here is that there are a handful of cards in Netrunner that do stuff for you. I think this one's called Beanstalk Royalties. It costs a card to play. It costs an action to play, and it has no cost to play, so it doesn't cost you any money. It gets you $3. So if we look at this, when I spend one card and one action, because this is one action, this is one action, this is 0 actions, it gets me $3. $3 is 3 actions. So when I play this card, I have a net of plus $1, which is the same as one action. So it's very easy to do the evaluation here in Netrunner because an action is $1 and $1 is a card and a card is so forth, right? So this card gets me $1. This card, hedge fund, I want to say, is the same idea, but it's 5 money that gets me 9, which seems like a very large number, but once you do all the math, this is 1, 2, 7 total, 9 to 7, you're netting $2 off this card. And this last card, it costs a lot, it costs 10, and it gives you 15 money, which seems so much more than 3. But at the end of the day, the net gain is only $3, right? Yes?
I'm trying to remember, in Netrunner, when you pick get a money, 1?
Yes, yeah. So one action is 1 money is a card, and playing a card is also an action.
So it's not like you pick get money, you get 2, you only get 1.
Yeah, it's only 1. There might be other card effects in the game that change that, but yeah, that's the gist of it. Well, money is an action is a card, and blah, blah, blah. So Netrunner is a good example because all those things are literally just the same in the game. So anyway, these 3 cards, you can see that this one is less powerful than that, is less powerful than that. Which brings us into a concept called conditional balancing, okay? So you can have cards that are stronger and weaker in the game. And you can introduce those more imbalanced cards, but by having conditions associated with them. So for example, here, if we look at the game, you start the game with, I think, 5 money, or 4 money, and money is gained and lost as you play the game. But the idea is that you can't go lower than 0, but you could have infinite money. But because Beanstalk Royalties costs 0 money to play, you can play it all the time. This card is 100% $1, always $1. Whereas with the higher cards, sometimes you don't have 5 money. Sometimes this card is useless. So you don't necessarily get to have the benefit of 2 money. So part of the time, you can get $2. And this card is even more prohibitively expensive. I think that certain decks need to actually actively work to make sure that they have $10 in the bank. Some decks maybe never have $10 in the bank, so this card would be useless to them. But the point here is that as we go increasing the cost, this condition makes it so that even though this card is stronger than the other cards, it's imbalanced. By having this condition meaning that you can only play it part of the time, it makes it fair, despite that. So even though you have these imbalanced cards, by having those conditions, it means that you can introduce that kind of content into your games. You can have that wildly powerful card as long as there are conditions associated with it, which makes it feel fair, which makes it play fairly overall. We're going to talk about 2 more concepts here. So one here, there's another one called, I think, Adonis Campaign, which is a little more complicated. The idea here is that it's 1 card, 1 action, it costs 4 money to play, and it gets you 3 money a turn for 4 turns. Now, that's a little more complicated, because overall it's going to get you 12 money, and the net gain is going to be, what is that? So it's 12 minus 7. I think I did my math wrong. It should be plus 5 over there, something like that. Anyway, the point here is that this card is a little more hard to evaluate because it gets you more money over turns. So now it's kind of hard to say whether this condition is enough to justify the fact that it's a plus 5 money card. Okay? And the last card down here is a card that's been banned in Netrunner. Netrunner is a competitive game. This card's called Violet
Level Clearance.
Violet Level Clearance. So this card's been banned because it's too powerful. The game is competitive. It has an active competitive scene. The people who are in charge of deciding what cards are going to be played to make sure the environment is fair have decided to not play with this card in the competitive scene because this card is too powerful. The idea here is that it costs 1, 1, and 5, which is the same as Hedge Fund, okay, because this card's also standard in the game. But it gives you $8 and 4 cards. And the idea here is that money is cards and cards are money, so it gives you 12 benefit. So it has plus 5 overall, which puts it even stronger than the other most prohibitive card over here. So if we think that these cards are fair, and we like these cards in our game, and we introduce this Violet Level Clearance to our game, we now can see that we have an imbalanced card in there. Now they tried to balance it out by adding condition. End your turn when played, okay? So sometimes that matters a lot. But if you play it as the last action for your turn, there's no downside. So their decision to add this condition was not prohibitive enough to players. It was too easy to play this very strong card. They would need to add more concessions in order to make this card play. Like maybe it costs 3 actions to play, or maybe you have to play it first and you end your turn, or maybe your opponent gets a victory point or something like that. But the point here is that this card, you can see just by doing this little conversion, it's stronger than the other ones. It doesn't have any conditions that make it too weak, and that's kind of a problem for your game. Okay, but yeah, that's the idea here. I think I need to check my notes to make sure I'm on target. Anybody have any questions here? Please, Josh first.
Okay, so you've given two examples of
Sure.
analysis which are interesting, but there's a key difference that I'd like to ask about.
Sure.
So in this netrunner case, you're looking at net benefit.
Right.
It's what you gain less what you spend to get it.
Mhm.
And in the Hearthstone, you have a ratio of
Right.
and these are different things.
Mhm.
So can you explain the reasoning behind
Right.
these, or is it just you pick one for your?
So, like we said before with your comment, was that certain games have rules, and the rules kind of dictate what the value of things are within the game. In Netrunner, because you are kind of a resource conversion game, it's a card game, but it's like there's a resource conversion, and there's very clean resource conversion. You can do the math very simply and figure out what the value of things are. In Hearthstone, we have to fudge it a little bit because we don't necessarily know the exact value of 1 power versus 2 power versus 10 versus 30. Because the way that there's more gameplay involved there. In Netrunner, if you have $1, I just have $1, and I can spend the dollar in very predictable ways. But in Hearthstone, if I have a 2-power creature and you have a 3-power creature, the values change a lot, right? If I play a 10-10 on the board in Hearthstone, but everyone's playing 20-20s, it has a very different valuation. So the goal with Hearthstone was just to have some number that we can work with, that we can start trying to evaluate the power levels of things, that we can use consistently across all of them. Even if the number is not necessarily accurate, you still have time to revise it, right? You have time to learn more about your game, you have time to maybe run some numbers, change the equation, try to figure out how to make it balance out. But the point here is that this game is much easier to do it, because it's just numbers is numbers. And the other game, because of the rules of the game, it's harder to do that evaluation. So we did it just by making a ratio of this to that and doing our best guess. So I wouldn't say that the cards in Hearthstone are correctly evaluated when I say that this is a 1.75. That's all very relative, okay? But the point is that you do have a number that you can compare. You can run it in a spreadsheet, you can have it sort by that number, and now you have an idea what your strongest and weakest cards are. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about conditional power. So let's talk 2 seconds about broken concepts. So there's a concept in competitive games called broken. And violet level clearance is considered a broken card. And that's because, within the game's context, because it's a deck building game, that means that players are able to just pick whatever card they want and play them. So with violet level clearance, players would just pick the best cards. They would just pick all the best cards, and you see all these players playing these broken cards because their goal is to be competitive. Their goal is to win and beat other players, so playing good cards is a good way to do that. Anyway, in competitive card games, broken is a very common term, and basically it refers to any piece of content which is too strong overall. And ultimately, people who are monitoring the competitive card games try to remove broken cards when they can. Some of them can be a little bit broken, or some of them can be a little bit too strong, but if it's way too strong, that means that a lot of players are going to play that card, and then they're not going to play the other cards. So we're back in a situation where some cards are too obvious a decision, and it makes the other decisions in the game less interesting and less common overall. I guess that kind of brings into I think that's the last topic is going to be metagaming. So there's one more term that I referred to, this is another CCG term called metagaming. And the idea is that if we have a room full of people, and we're all making decisions about how to play a game, let's say we're all playing a competitive card game. If there's going to be kind of something called a metagame, and that's the idea that your decisions are going to be different than your decisions, are going to be different than your decisions, but there might be some overlap. Like maybe I build a deck, and I include 4 violet level clearance. And Josh, the established game designer he is also going to play 4 violet level clearance. And then you play 4 violet level clearance, and you do, and you do, and you do. At that point, you can see that the metagame, that is to say, the decisions that different players are making within this game's design space are all kind of converging towards this broken card. Which means that you better be pretty happy that this card gives you a good play experience. Okay? You better be very happy, and if you're not happy about that, then you should probably do something about it. Now the thing with the board game is that you really have one chance to set down a box that is a good experience for the players. Unlike CCGs where they have new cards coming out all the time, and they have a ban list, and they can be like, no, don't play this card ever again. As a board game, you can't really do that. You're just like, here's a box, have fun, good luck. So you want to make sure that your game is balanced when it hits the table consistently. And ultimately, you're trying your best, broken cards get into games all the time. I've house ruled that, oh yeah, we're just gonna throw this card out, we're just gonna rip it apart, we don't like this card anymore. Whoever gets it just wins, or whoever gets it just loses. So in my home group, when we play games, sometimes we'll do that. Sometimes we'll change a rule, sometimes we'll rip up a card. Just because we know that having this card in the game is an obvious choice or an obvious not choice, and we don't need that, right? We wanna have more close, interesting decisions for our players overall. So yeah, so the idea there is metagaming is decisions that different players make, and brokenness is the idea that certain cards are too powerful and that lots of players are going to make the same decision. And that was a lot of talking, but I think I'm good. I think that was everything I really wanted to talk about today. So yeah. Sure. So the big takeaways today are that a completely balanced game has no real decisions because all decisions are equally effective. That kind of kills the game experience unless you're going for that. Maybe you just want to have a nice little activity. Maybe you just want to play charades. Maybe you just want, there are games that want to do that. Also having a highly imbalanced game, a game where things are wild and crazy, and like, oh, I drew the I win card, or I drew the you lose card, games like that, where some of the content is very strong and some of the content is not as strong. That also has appeal. There are games that do want to do that, but again, I recommend that they be short. I recommend that you want them to be kind of like wild and exciting, and I recommend that they be kind of light experiences overall, and that tends to lend themselves to those things. And for the more balanced games, you can have them be longer, you can have them be strategic, you can have them be competitive or more challenging overall. Yeah, spreadsheets are your friend. If you don't use them for your card game or card game design, I recommend that you kind of get into them, get them part of your workflow. I wish I could have just thrown a spreadsheet up here and kind of done it live with you all, but limitations. And yeah, I think that's basically the major things I wanted to point out. Is just that like balancing is very important, even for simple games, even like simple games like Uno. You can use spreadsheets to fix it up. And yeah, don't overbalance your game, don't underbalance your game, just don't balance the fun away, basically. So.
And make sure to play test.
Make sure to play test. Playtesting is the bottom line. There. So yeah, I think that's all the stuff I want to cover. Thank you very much. And yeah, if anybody has any questions or if you want to hang around, or I missed you before.
So if you're trying to like evaluate, give it a number.
Sure.
What the challenge I've run into is when you have two, say they're cards.
Sure.
That have an interaction with each other.
Right.
And A is okay, but with B is dramatically better.
Right.
Or something like that. How do you assess?
This gets into the idea of that conditional power, that you can have cards that can be on average weaker, but within certain combinations or under certain conditions, in your case, that you have card A and card B, they become stronger. I think one way to assess that is to try to figure out roughly how often does that occur in the average game. So, for example, let's take Hearthstone, for example. In Hearthstone, you gain 1 mana every turn, you draw 1 card every turn. So, on turn 1, you have 1 mana and so forth. If your average game ends on turn 6 or 7, that means that smaller and smaller portions of the game are going to end on turn 8, 9, 10. You might never have 8, 9, or 10 mana in a game to play a card that costs that much. So the idea is that because those cards are played less often, you can make them stronger. So in your case, you're saying, well, I guess the question would be, how often does card A and card B show up at the same time? So if you can put a very rough numerical estimation on that, or you could run the numbers and go look up card probability to see how often do I draw A and B, then now you have a pretty good idea of how strong it would be, right? Because you do the mathematical evaluation and then you kind of multiply it by how often you would have it. And now you have that times the condition, and now you have a more accurate value overall.
So how would you value B then?
It depends what B does. Does B give you 5 apples, or does B convert 10 oranges into 30 victory points? It's really hard to say. It depends what the card does, because the rules of the game do matter a lot.
I will chime in with, when we were talking about Magma Rajo being 3 mana, 5/1. With how Hearthstone is today, Mage has 2 mana, deal 1. Death Knight has hero power that can create a 1-mana guy with charge, and so that could attack the Magma Rager. And then Death Knight also has a hero power that attacks for 1. So there's at least 3 hero powers. 2 can do it on turn 1. 1 can do it on turn 2. Well, and then Druid can also do it on 2 attack into it. So there's at least 4 right now that can actively get rid of the Magma Rager.
Right.
So that one would be more of a conditional one at this point with how the game's going on.
Right. So in this case, Magma Rager, when we looked at the numbers, is a little bit weaker of cards overall, but because of the conditions of the game, other game content, we just talked about how like 3 or 4 of the different choices you make as far as like, so in the game there's 10 different classes, and you pick a class and you get all the cards from that class. Classes also just have an ability that you can always use. 4 of them are able to just be like, pow, Magma Rager's gone. And then you have a net gain of mana and a net gain of cards. So we don't know that when we make the Magma Rager evaluation.
Yeah.
But now that we know that Magma Rager is even weaker than it appeared at first glance. Okay? Because anybody can spend 2 mana and 0 cards to destroy it. That card is now conditionally even less powerful, which is unfortunate for Magma Rager, which is why it doesn't get played in that game.
Can I add on to this?
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So I've been working on CCDs for like 4 years now.
Sure.
At this point, and I find, especially for card games, because they're so difficult to balance, this type of stuff is really, really useful to have as a framework to establish your initial impressions of what the card balance may be like. So these Android Neverwinter examples are really great because they are all talking about economic cards.
Right.
And so the economy is really easy to understand. And so economic cards are very easy to evaluate. What you're talking about is the combination of cards and how they interact with one another. And that is where you leave your framework. And so you need to play test to understand what the impact of those different combinations are. So the framework, I think, is a really great starting point, but the play testing is really where you need to understand, okay, just how powerful is this, and how does this impact the player experience, and is this what I'm going for in my game, right? If it does something that you don't want players to be able to do in your game, like prevent another player from playing the game, that is a very common combination for combos.
Some skip cards over here.
Yeah.
Then it's no longer a thing that even matters how good or bad it is. There's a lot of examples in card games where a combo happens in 5% of the games and wins in, like, the deck wins 20% of the time, but it gets banned or hotfixed or something because the play experience is that bad.
Right.
So all of it is definitely
You need the arbitrary adjustment column in your spreadsheet.
That does happen. That does happen because I'm in the beginning of the talk. I did want to, and I'll say it again, is that playtesting is the bottom line. Like you can have the most beautiful spreadsheet in the world. If you playtest it and it's bad, it's bad. Okay, that's the bottom line. But you can save yourself a lot of playtests by doing a little bit of math ahead of time. The other thing I want to mention is that the other caveat was that you need things that are quantifiable, right? Because if you can't convert it into a number, you can't really make a spreadsheet about it. Because there are effects in other card games that are just really hard to quantify. Like in there might be like what's it called? Like Yogi, you have cards that you have to like balance on your head or put in your arm. How do you quantify? Like what is the EV on this effect? Right? If I have to do it twice, all of a sudden I'm out of arms. I can't do anything. But because you can't quantify it, you then have to make the best assessment you have of how difficult the card is or how strong the card would be. And you can do that. You could just arbitrarily be like, oh yeah, putting it in the crook of your arm, that's a 1. Putting it on your head, that's a 2, and so forth, and kind of make your best guess as to how difficult the cards would be. And in that way, you can still balance things, although you have to understand it's a little bit fuzzier overall, because ultimately you're doing weird stuff. It's kind of a fuzzy evaluation.
There was someone who raised their hand in the back that we didn't get to. It was somewhere over there.
It would have to do with the previous comment.
Okay.
Sure, please.
The thing where like you have like if these 2 cards like show up, it becomes much more powerful.
Right.
Is like that's such a common thing that shows up that I think that like a special case should be addressed. There's a probability distribution called a hypergeometric distribution. And that'll just give you the probability of those 2 cards showing up in your hand, given all the parameters you need. If you're feeling like doing the stats, you can calculate the conditional probability of that happening, and then presumably
you can do
multiplying it times the power that you did before, and getting that a better idea about what's going on.
That you can go deeper with this. One point that I want to make is this is meant to be kind of a very introductory concept of balancing in games. I didn't want to go too deep into the math, especially since we don't have a spreadsheet, I don't have any calculators, I don't have anything I can demonstrate actively. But if you want to, you can do even more homework and balance your game even better overall. And that's the point that we're trying to make over there.
But one of the best game examples I can think of that does that is Dominion. Like Dominion has a lot of cards that if you have like them both in the hand, it's identical. And I don't think they did that. And I think it's good that they didn't do that. Like they tested it out. You know?
Well, I mean, I think that they playtested it a lot, and then like the cards felt all right, and then they just went with it.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you can do that, and playtesting is important, and you should be doing that. But if you can solve yourself 10 playtests by making one spreadsheet, I recommend that. Please.
So obviously, you want your game balanced, right?
To some degree.
And we've discussed like some complications with that.
Sure.
You know, as far as either they're showing up at different times in the game, or
Right.
Especially with combos. I don't even think we mentioned multi-use cards. So all that,
Sure.
all that aside, what do you think, in your opinion, is more important? A balanced game or a game that feels good?
That's another good point. Didn't get to that. It depends on what you're going for. Because here's the thing. Some designers want the game to be a positive play experience for their players, like as much as possible, and that's like their number one goal is to have players have a good time and have fun. And what you're just saying is that like you want the decisions in the game to feel balanced, even if they are imbalanced, right? Because that ultimately lends itself to that positive play experience. That's good, and that's a decision that you're making as a designer. Ultimately, it's kind of your choice about whether you want to make these like little push things a little bit this way or like fudge a number over here to get it to feel right to your players when they play it. But you can also go the opposite and just make sure like, okay, I have the perfect mathematical game here, enjoy, this is my sandbox for you. And let players be a little bit mad that like, oh, this card doesn't feel right, even though it is right. And maybe that over time that they'll realize that that card is correctly balanced as they play the game. But ultimately that's a decision that you're gonna make as a designer about whether you want the game to always feel good or to be good, but not necessarily always feel good, if that kind of makes sense.
Sure.
Please.
One thing I would add to that, people are not good at intuiting certain types of probability.
Yep.
And I've run into the problem where mathematically this is fair.
Right.
But it's one of those, weird areas that unless you're like really understand the math, you're intuitively gonna feel like it's unfair.
Right.
Like the example of like, if you have a certain number of people and how many do you think would have the same birthday, and it's always
Right. It's like
blows
25
your
or
mind.
something, right?
The math just doesn't work.
Right.
If you run into one of those, in my experience at least, it's kind of a deal breaker because it's always gonna feel wrong, even if the math works.
Yeah, it's either gonna be wrong or it's gonna feel wrong, right? Yeah.
So I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just saying I've run into that.
But like we said, it's a decision that you have to make as a designer, what works the best for your game. And you can have rough edges on your game. It's fine if you can't find a way around it. As long as the rest of the game is a good enough experience, just do your best to go with it.
And it does suggest that you may not have all the dimensions of the metric. You may not be calculating quite the right thing. And so it's an opportunity to look at what else is going on, what other information are you missing in balancing that.
Yeah.
And when that situation genuinely comes up, when it's not that I'm missing something, sometimes I find if the gap isn't too big, the best approach is to split the difference. So then the one player can feel very clever that they know the math and they're getting the advantage,
right?
And the other player can
feel
getting the perceived advantage.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that recommended that when you're balancing a game, it's like not unreasonable in like digital games anyway to like double a value or halve a value and then see how it feels. And what you're saying is like you just like cut a quarter off. We'll cut the difference. So yeah, that's totally legitimate strategy to figure out how to make your game feel right or how to play right. But how are we doing on time?
It's 5 minutes to 3 at this point.
Yeah. Oh, please.
So.
A couple more.
I can imagine it probably sort of answered the question in terms of just converting everything to final value, but how do you balance like asymmetrical games? So far we've just been talking about games where all players have the same actions, but in a game like Root, everyone has like different actions.
They have different goals. So one thing that you could do there is you could evaluate either board presence. That's a possibility. So like the amount of ability you have to influence the board. You could also evaluate it as victory points. So like if I do this, I get this many victory points. And it might not even be one. It might be like a fraction of a victory point by playing this card, or like that kind of thing. You can consider it in those ways. Root gets complicated because like you said, it's asymmetric, so all the players have slightly different rules applying to them. Yeah, that's a tough. I would need to look closer at Root about exactly how it's doing and how the cards are converting into stuff.
Netrunner is asymmetrical.
Oh, okay.
So
it technically is asymmetrical, but the players do both have 4 actions. So like, economically
so
one is
that's
close.
That's yeah.
Sure.
Like Netrunner is an asymmetrical game, but it uses the action and gold system, which both players use, to balance the things out. And in theory, if everything is balanced, then 5 gold for the corporation is of equal value as 5 gold for the runner.
Okay.
Right. That was a decision that they made, though. Aside from that, the corporation does have some other problems that they have to deal with. Like part of their deck is victory points, which are useless, and they have to spend a bunch of money and actions to make the victory points do something for them. Where the runner just like takes it, so they get like free stuff. But when they designed the cards, they took that in mind. So the runner ends up being, the corporation is overall a little bit weaker. I guess their cards are a little more powerful overall, and the runner has more stuff to do, but their cards are a little bit weaker overall. Like it's easier for them to get like messed up or get hurt by something. The corporation can like only lose points, whereas the runner can like permanently lose cards. They can lose their stuff on the board. Things can blow up, that kind of thing. But those are decisions that they made in terms of how they did it. But yeah, asymmetric games I would say can be pretty hard to balance, especially if players are doing very different things or things that don't interact with each other. That might also be hard. What's that from? What's that Harry Potter game, Quidditch? Where like the one who gets the golden thingy just wins the game, right? How do you balance that? Like it's a totally different game. It's a sub game of your overall game. So and just doesn't interact with the rest of the game that much. Anyway, I'm feeling pretty. Yeah, please. Yep.
Would you, for something like that, would you say
Cool.
Everyone's
They like
Can I put this by you if you don't mind?
I can totally move this stuff.
On Twitch.